So Ukraine invaded Russia. Yep, you heard that correctly. Ukraine invaded Russia. In the last couple days, they've pushed into Kursk, the western portion of Russia, and taken over 200 square kilometers of territory. This is not like previous cross-border raids where a couple dozen groups affiliated with the Ukrainian military pushed in and after a day or two were pushed out. This looks to be hundreds, maybe even thousands of Ukrainian troops, and there's reports right now that they're digging in to stay. Now, there's a lot of mixed information about this one right now. For starters, Ukraine isn't talking about this like at all, which is also different from previous cross-border incursions. So a lot of what we have to go over today is coming directly from Russian sources. So take that, interpret that however you will. In some cases, Russia tends to underreport Ukrainian progress, but even if we view it in that sense, it looks like Ukraine has made quite a bit of progress, again, inside of Russian territory. Now, from what we can tell at this point, this is not the normal actors of cross-border raids in the Belgorod region. In the past, we've had groups like the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Siberia Legion, the Georgia Legion, that really carried out these raids on their own, likely with some degree of support from the Ukrainian military. But that was important to show that these weren't necessarily elements of the Ukrainian armed forces carrying out, essentially, an illegal invasion into a foreign country, right? This time it's different. And while some of those groups might be involved, they're certainly keeping a low profile and are not posting anything about it on their Telegram channels. But what we're getting from Russia, and based off of some pictures and videos we've seen, Russia says, this is Rybar, the Russian media channel, says on the Ukrainian side, the 82nd and 80th Separate Airborne Assault Brigades are currently advancing with the support of the 22nd and 61st Separate Mechanized Brigades of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Now, it's not important that you know who those elements are, where they came from, how they're outfitted. The important part is we have Russia now saying that these are active components of the regular Ukrainian military taking part in this operation. That raises a lot of concerns for Ukraine's allies. Looking at this, it's a different aspect of the war. Ukraine at this point is no longer just on the defensive, trying to protect their territory, but actively pushing into another country's sovereign territory, in this case, Russia at Kursk. Of course, there's a good argument to be made that they're doing this because they're in an active war with Russia, so it's not entirely out of the blue, but it is a difference from previous operations. Now, I should note that the United States at this point, from everything they've put out, it sounds like the U.S. was caught off guard. Again, I don't know any more on that than you, so maybe there were some back-channel communications. This does seem like something that the U.S. would try to tamp down. Probably wouldn't want Ukraine to carry out this type of operation. But as of now, reports from the Pentagon and the White House really make it seem like when news of this operation came out, the Pentagon was hearing about it about the same time as you and I. Now, I mentioned that we're going to be using a lot of Russian sources today, and what I'm going to do in the description of this video is provide links to all the different sources that I'm using here, including the maps. A lot of these are on Telegram, so whether, if you use that platform, great, you can check these out. Cross-reference all of them to the best of your ability, but what we have right now is a lot of mixed information, a lot of bad reports coming out, later being disproven or proven correct in some cases. So be careful, but if you're trying to follow along with this event as quickly as possible, please consider checking out some of the links in the description below. Those are a lot of the places that I go to gather information for these videos. Now, first and foremost, I want to pull up a map to show people where this is taking place. This is the map that I traditionally use in these videos. It's called Deep State Map. It's a publicly available resource. It, of course, will be linked in the description below. We're not going to use this today because it's not actually being updated. But to give you an idea on Deep State Map where this is taking place, we've got Ukraine here in the middle. For reference, the color here, the green portions, is territory that Russia at one point occupied and Ukraine has since liberated. And we'll zoom in here to the east. The kind of purple regions here in the Donbass and in Crimea is territory that Russia captured in 2014. And then this orange area here, Melitopol, Mariupol, and kind of north of Luhansk, that is territory captured by the Russian forces since the 2022 invasion. So a lot of the focus, and we will come back to this at some point, is here in the eastern portion of Ukraine. But the operations, the cross-border raids that we're seeing play out right now are in Kursk. So again, zooming out a little bit, Kursk up here to the northeast of Ukraine with forces possibly coming from the Sumy direction. Now, to give you an idea of the progress that's being made, one map that I did find that is providing relatively real-time updates, or as real-time as I've seen so far during this operation, is I always forget the name of it, Suryak Maps, excuse me. And I'll link their map here in the description as below as well. So we're going to zoom in to this area here in Kursk. This light blue on the screen is the territory that at this point, as of this recording on the morning of August 8th, 2024, Ukrainian forces have occupied. Now, a key note before getting into some of the Russian assessments as to how this is playing out, this area on the map is kind of the limit of advance for Ukrainian forces, right? So when you see kind of the tip of where this blue goes, that's kind of the extent to where Ukrainian forces have moved. That does not mean that everything inside of this territory is currently occupied by Ukrainian forces or that any one of these villages is now a Ukrainian strongpoint. All right, so they may have bypassed some areas, and some areas might be more fortified than others, so keep that in mind as we get through this. Now, one of the key sources that I've found pretty reliable over the last couple of years and seems to really be on top of things during this Kursk operation is a Russian mill blogger called Two Majors. Tends to have relatively in-depth information, a lot of sources throughout the Russian military, and he's provided pretty good breakdowns over the last couple days as to what's happening in Kursk. Right now, he says the situation is complicated by the work of the enemy's air defense, which creates risks for our aviation's actions against enemy armored vehicles. The Russian army is pulling in reinforcements. So what he's getting at here is an issue that we saw with Ukraine's offensive in the south in 2023 was often the maneuver elements got out ahead of air defense assets. That opened them up for a lot of strikes by Russian helicopters, rotary wing aircraft, as well as loiter munitions and or drones. Essentially, think of air defense like a bubble, and it can only provide so much protection, and a lot of the tanks, armor, and infantry got outside of that bubble and opened themselves up to pretty significant attacks. What they're seeing in Kursk is that a lot of that air defense was forward deployed. So it's preventing the the Russian Air Force from bringing significant air power overhead and striking these positions. Now, I should note that just in the last couple of days, we've seen quite a few videos and pictures of destroyed Ukrainian equipment in Kursk. I'll play some of that here. Russian air power and loiter munitions are taking a toll on the Ukrainian forces. So they are getting through to some degree, but Two Majors is not the only one. A fair amount of Russian mill bloggers right now are talking about the challenges of pushing aircraft into this region, just given the nature of the air defense threat. So in that sense, Ukraine certainly learned and adapted from the last major offensive operation last summer in the south. They say, we're informed that the enemy has begun to erect fortifications in the Kursk region, which indicates preparations for a long-term defensive action. The following actions are taking place: trenches, dugouts, and caponniers. The enemy began to dig full-profile shelters for personnel and equipment. Fortifications allow the enemy to strengthen and hold positions for a long time. So this is one of the big questions that we'll get to later in this segment. People are asking, how can Ukraine expect to hold this territory if we move down further south in the Donbass? Their areas over here where they've been fortifying for upwards of 10 years and Russian forces are still pushing through. And they're well defended. They have significant trench networks. The guns are dug in, minefields, artillery is sighted, and all of that stuff, and they're still ceding territory. So why would it be any different up here in Kursk? But according to these Russian sources, right now they're actively digging in and trying to create some sort of fortifications to stop Russian forces when they come to retake that territory. A lot of similarities right now between what we're seeing in Kursk and what we saw in Kharkiv in the fall of 2022. So Kharkiv is this blue area here, and you see this was all territory at one point taken by the Russian forces. And in the fall of 2022, Ukraine really caught them off guard, exploited some weak points in the lines, and quickly ran the Russian forces out. They were evacuating, retreating in a panic, in a sense. The lines, in retrospect, ended up being very thinly manned, and Ukraine quickly took control over retook control over this area. That is kind of on a smaller scale what this is looking like here. So if Ukraine was able to do that in Kharkiv and reestablish defenses and stop the Russians from recapturing that territory, it's possible that they could be trying to do the same thing here, albeit inside of Russia instead of inside of Ukraine. They say, considering the pulled-up equipment, the Ukrainian armed forces will consolidate their positions in the captured settlements. The scale of the forces and resources pulled to the Russian borders demonstrates that this time it is unlikely to be Kazinka. Apparently, the Ukrainian command is seriously counting on some kind of strategic success. The enemy's plan to break through to the Kursk nuclear power plant is evident. Our side is taking measures to protect this facility. And this gets, I'm trying not to bounce around here, but this gets a little bit into the what is Ukraine doing here in the first place. And to look at the map here, the Kursk nuclear power plant, we have to zoom out quite a bit, is up just west of Kursk. Here we go. So in this area here, west of Kursk, there's suggestions on some Russian channels, again, nothing coming from the Ukrainian side, that might be the goal. I will say, as of this recording, it looks like Ukrainian forces have largely stopped advancing and are more focused at this point in digging in. If they were planning on advancing all the way to that nuclear power plant, they would have to continue going and probably wouldn't want to stop for Russian reinforcements to move into the area. The argument that some Russian channels have made about the nuclear power plant being the goal is that if Ukraine were to occupy that facility, it would make it very hard for Russia to take it back, right? You don't want to turn a nuclear power plant into a battlefield, battle zone. Some of the issues down around Zaporozhye in southern Ukraine, and it could be something used to negotiate some sort of settlement about possibly other areas of Ukraine. Again, that is exclusively coming from Russian sources. I've not seen anything on the Ukrainian side to suggest that, and it's a pretty bold move, all things considered. That's a lot of territory to move through and hold in order to get forces to that nuclear power plant. But I did feel like that was worth bringing up. Two majors continued, saying, despite the active transfer of reinforcements, the rapid buildup of the cover group, and the involvement of reserves, the main problem has not yet been resolved. The number of Ukrainian formations, the reserves of military equipment in the direction, and the military potential of the enemy have not yet been exhausted. The second echelon is preparing to enter the battle. A high concentration of forces is noted in other directions of the Kursk region. And this is from about the first 12 hours of this. Right out the gate, there was a lot of confusion as to what was happening. Very early on, some of these Russian mill bloggers started saying, this looks like an advanced element. There's indications that Ukrainian forces are building up elsewhere and may continue to push across the border or reinforce these Ukrainian gains. That still seems to be a primary concern from a lot of Russian sources at this point. Now, I do want to shift over to a couple of Ukrainian sources at this point, and largely what we're getting on the Ukrainian side, only one of these that I'm going to mention here is actually in Ukraine. The rest are more Western analysts that tend to look at things from a Ukrainian perspective. They're going off of the same publicly available information that you and I are. They're very well versed in this. These are experts. They're able to draw some different conclusions, but I do want to stress that this is not necessarily coming from Ukraine. It's an outsider's perspective. John Heelan said, according to multiple reports, Ukraine has concentrated elements of 2 to 4 brigades in the area. Pull the map back up. These would be gravely needed in the east. It's also unclear how Ukraine is going to hold on to territories here longer term if it can't hold on to territories in the east, where it has had time to prepare defenses. He says trying to hold on to areas in Kursk while also trying to desperately hang on to areas in the east is likely going to eat up more Ukrainian resources than just concentrating resources to holding the eastern front line. So Heelan talking about 2 to 4 brigades, possibly. At this point, if we look at a Ukrainian brigade being about 1,000 people, that could be upwards of 4,000 soldiers, maybe, in this area. That's a lot. Early reports coming from the Russian side are pretty wide-ranging. I've heard as low as 300, as many as 2,000. I think something that's not being counted right now, and both sides are kind of hinting at this, are the elements inside of Ukraine here to the west that could be deployed or have not yet deployed or maybe taking part in some other capacity, providing air defense coverage, maybe strike capability with long-range munitions, resupply, whatever it might be. There's likely a much larger element contributing to this fight that isn't actively on the front lines now in Russia. Now I want to shift back to deep state map. I find this one a lot easier to look at. It's just, I don't know, the not being a satellite view. The satellite view throws me at times when trying to get big picture views here. So again, recognize that this map is not showing the updates in Kursk, but I wanted to zoom in on some of these areas that John Heelan was talking about in the east, where there's been a lot of rapid Russian progress, all things considered, in the eastern portion of the country over the last few months, compared to how the lines have changed throughout this war, especially in the last year and a half. The progress made by Russia west of Avdiivka is significant. They have pushed very far through Ukrainian lines. This area up here, in and around Toretsk, there's rumors that this pocket has been sealed off and the Ukrainian forces were made to evacuate before being cut off. Just like everywhere across the front right now. Those are two big ones. We've also got some up here in Chasiv Yar. Just a couple days ago, there was talk that Russian forces had actually made a bit of a breakthrough here, and were now fighting in an area of Chasiv Yar they hadn't previously reached. This is the story across all of eastern Ukraine, and a lot of the videos that I've made in recent weeks and months have talked about how Russia has made slow but steady progress in the east, and Ukraine has to find a way to stop that. So what John Heelan is hitting on here, and I'm seeing a lot of analysts talk about, is this decision to push, again, to zoom out on the map here, to instead of reinforcing portions along the east and the south where Ukraine is losing territory, to instead take these forces, whether they're in the hundreds or the thousands, and push them all the way up here in the north into Kursk. Look, it's a significant gamble. And I want to take a moment here to talk about what this could mean big picture and why we, quite frankly, don't know at this point. The gamble being taken here to redistribute, desperately needed troops in the east and the south to an offensive operation into Russian territory means that we're kind of playing with a different deck of cards than we originally thought. This means at the very least, which should be understood, the Ukrainian armed forces have significantly more information available to them than we do on the outside. So trying to understand why they're doing this, what the end state is, and how they, weighed the different options is impossible at this point. This is the kind of thing that we're going to have to wait and see how this further develops. But it's clear, I would say at this point, that this is a significant gamble for the Ukrainian forces. I want to open up to Rob Lee here as well, another incredible analyst, who said, compared to previous cross-border operations, this one is notable in that it appears to involve Ukrainian conventional forces and not just from the GUR. That's the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian armed forces. So not GUR elements and then some of these one-off groups like the Russian Volunteer Corps, Freedom of Russia Legion, but actually conventional forces. And Andrew Perpetua, apologies in the pronunciation there, actually hit on this as well, saying Ukraine has been systematically destroying the electrical infrastructure and communications network in the Sudza area for weeks. And I'll show some of those pictures here that Andrew sourced yesterday and geolocated recent Ukrainian strikes, suggesting that this action being taken, just from the outside looking in, it has been better planned, better resourced, and better executed than any cross-border operation carried out by Ukraine to date. And it's really not even close. So the fact that we saw multiple pieces of infrastructure and communications network targeted in the lead up to this operation, but somehow Ukraine still was able to maintain the element of surprise, that's significant. Then moving back to Lee, a notable point here, and I think the map would be useful in this context. He says Ukraine is not able to employ HIMARS in support of this operation because the U.S. only authorized strikes in Belgorod relevant to Russia's Kharkiv offensive. So this was a little further south and east, where we saw Russia push in from Belgorod towards Kharkiv, this red area here. When this happened, the United States granted Ukraine permission to begin using U.S. munitions to strike Russian targets related to this offensive, to really stop them. And the reason for that is Kharkiv is a major population center in Ukraine. There was a concern that Russia could, at the very least, bring Kharkiv into tube artillery range and kind of pummel the city, and then worst case scenario, actually push forward and take the city of Kharkiv entirely. So when this happened, Ukraine kind of, the handcuffs were taken off. They could start using U.S. precision munitions, long-range munitions like the HIMARS, to strike inside of Russian territory, but only in Belgorod. Moving up here to Kursk, that's a different story. That permission has not yet been granted, and you wonder if it will be. Because again, this is an offensive operation being carried out by Ukraine, understandably so, but does the U.S. view that all that differently than what's happening in Belgorod? My guess is probably yes, and at this point, that authorization has not been granted, and from everything I've seen, HIMARS have not been used in this operation. And then Lee adds a note here on Russian personnel available for this. He says, Russia has greater forces and conventional capabilities in the area, better command and control, and it has conscript units that can be deployed, which are not used in Ukraine. It is unlikely that this operation will force Russia to pull significant forces from Ukraine. So a note to kind of explain that there is, in Russia, conscripts legally have to be used in Ukraine. They cannot be used in a foreign war zone. Now, there's some speculation on if those forces that are conscripted then are able to be moved into some of the recently annexed territory by Russia, and there's some indications that they certainly have been. So you end up with conscripts in portions of Ukraine that Russia now says are theirs, and they're right along the front lines. But there's also a lot of conscripts throughout the country of Russia that could be moved to defend this area without, really having to get within that blurry gray zone at all. And that hints at one of the reasons that a lot of folks have pointed to here about maybe this is being carried out to pull Russian forces from elsewhere. And what Lee argues is they're not going to have to. We haven't seen that yet. Russia has enough forces along the front. They're not at risk of falling. Remember, they're still advancing. And there's plenty of conscripts from around Russia that could be mobilized to the Kursk region. Now, I want to shift a little bit to what the possible goal is here. And for that, I'm going to look to Terragami, a former Ukrainian reserve officer. This is the one source of the handful I've gone through now that is currently in Ukraine. And he hit at a couple different things here that I thought were worth bringing up and maybe not top of mind right out the gate. He said the large number of POWs, prisoners of war, is a big humanitarian win for Ukraine. This is a good chance to exchange Ukrainian prisoners and a huge win for the families of Ukrainian soldiers who have been waiting for their loved ones for over a year. He says, in this case, incredible job by the Ukrainian armed forces. And we did see a handful of pictures and videos come out in recent days of quite a few Russian POWs, I mean dozens at the very least, being captured by Ukraine. That replenishes the prisoner swap fund and offers up the possibility that we have, fortunately been seeing prisoner swaps between Russia and Ukraine. Some people who have been held by Russia for months or even years could be coming home in the near future. But again, in terms of pulling Russian forces from elsewhere along the front, to go back to the map here, Terragami hits on the same thing that Rob Lee talked about, where he said, so far there's no evidence of Russian forces slowing down their offensive operations, nor is there evidence that Russia is moving any reserves or units from the center grouping of forces. This can change, but not at the moment, hence my skepticism. And I should note, so he's talking about anybody along these, all these red dots, this whole area of the front, really from this yellow portion up here, all the way up here in Belgorod. Nobody at all at this point really has been seen as moving. There was an indication earlier today, the Wagner Group said they might be sending forces to the region, but that's a small element, all things considered. And I should note, Terragami there at the end of his comment said, hence my skepticism. And I'm seeing a mixed reaction across the internet. There's a lot of folks excited to see the fight taken to Russia instead of Ukraine constantly being on the defensive, and impressed that Ukraine was able to make this amount of progress in a very short period of time, which is impressive. But I'm seeing a lot of kind of professional, very measured analysts say, be cautious. It's not entirely clear what Ukraine is doing here. It's hard to imagine they have the manpower and the resources to carry out a long-term, large-scale operation into Russia. And there's concern as to how this will play into the broader war. Now, as for the Russian reaction to all of this, one thing that's been brought up throughout previous cross-border raids, it's going to hurt the Russian morale and maybe force the people to bring it into the war. We really haven't seen that in any case. Like when you look at the failure points of Russia in this war, whether it was withdrawing from Kyiv in the opening months, whether it was being pushed out of Kharkiv in the northeast, having to withdraw across the Dnipro in Kherson later that fall, or even some of these more recent cross-border raids, there's been panic and anger right out the gate, and then it pretty quickly fades. But we do have a couple key Russian figures here that I thought were at least worth bringing up to give you an idea of how this was being received. Rusich, a far-right organization associated with the Russian Ministry of Defense, whose leader has called himself a Nazi, so a neo-Nazi organization. Bad group, start to finish, multiple allegations of war crimes. They posted today, quote, 2 years have passed already. It is time to understand they are not people, talking about the Ukrainians, but sick animals who will never become Russians. War does not tolerate compassion. There are no civilians and no children. When they are all buried alive in their homes, we will win. So again, talking about the anger that any type of operation like this sparks. And then, look, I understand Rusich is kind of a fringe organization, all things considered, despite their official ties with the Russian government. So let's move back into the kind of political mainstream of Russia with Dmitry Medvedev, a former president and prime minister of Russia, who posted today on Telegram, quote, this is no longer just an operation to return our official territories and punish the Nazis. We can and must go to the lands of the still existing Ukraine, to Odessa, to Kharkov, to Dnipro, to Nikolaev, to Kyiv and further. There should be no restrictions in the sense of some borders of the Ukrainian Reich recognized by someone. And now we can and must talk about this openly without embarrassment and diplomatic courtesies. So again, that's kind of the general reaction across Russian media right now. For the folks exclusively focused on military affairs, I would say there's a little bit of panic and concern that Ukraine is building up forces in the Kursk region, that this thing is far from over. And then from more Russian senior officials, people like Medvedev, just very, very angry and talking about how enough's enough. We need to finish this war in Ukraine, if you will. But again, this is very much a developing situation. In the time that I've been recording this, I'm certain more things have changed. So again, please consider checking out the links in the description below to a bunch of other sources that I've used for this video that could help you stay up to date with this situation and others. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is also linked in the description below. Talk about a wide range of issues there. Our goal with Substack really is to provide background information on topics that you can then look back to as events play out. So, for instance, in the Middle East right now, there's a lot of concern about Hezbollah and what a war between Hezbollah and Israel might look like. So we have multiple articles talking about the nature of the Hezbollah threat, how they've been financed, the Iranian proxy network, things like that, that should be applicable to better understanding the situation today. That's all I got. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.